Some financial changes do not arrive as a shock. They do not come through frantic phone calls or urgent warnings. They arrive after years of silence, at the exact moment you believe everything is finally stable. And by the time you realize what is happening, the decision is no longer in your hands. For a long time, millions of student loan borrowers grew accustomed to the feeling that the system was standing still. Collections were paused. Paychecks were untouched. No immediate consequences followed. That silence lasted long enough for many people to believe this was the new normal. That if nothing went wrong today, tomorrow would probably look the same. Then, very quietly, the system began to move again. No noise, no drama, just official notices sent through standard procedures signaling that a period of leniency had come to an end. For borrowers in default, wages could once again become the point where the system intervenes directly, regardless of how stable their lives may appear. What makes this story unsettling is not the policy itself. It is the realization that many people will only discover they are affected after everything has already been decided. When income is no longer something you fully control. When choices that once existed have quietly disappeared without you noticing. In today's episode of Financial Secrets, we follow a very typical borrower, not someone irresponsible, not someone who abandoned their obligations, but someone who lived correctly, worked consistently, and believed they still had time to sort things out. Until he realized that the system's silence was not protection, but the pause before an irreversible process began. My name is Dolan. On Financial Secrets, I do not tell stories to scare you. I tell them to show how policy changes that seem distant can reach directly into personal financial life. This is not just a story about student debt. It is a story about what happens when you believe you still have choices, while the system has already begun choosing for you. The main character in this story is Michael. He is 39 years old and works full-time in logistics for a regional distribution company in the American Midwest. Michael is not unemployed, and he does not live on the edge. He has a stable job, earns enough to cover his living expenses, and follows a routine shared by millions of working adults. 15 years ago, Michael took out federal student loans to attend college, not out of ambition to get rich, but because it was the only path he saw to escape the low-income cycle his family had lived in for generations. From the outside, Michael's life looks calm and manageable. He rents a small apartment, drives an older car that is fully paid off, and rarely spends money on unnecessary things. He does not take on new debt. He checks his bank account regularly and works hard to keep every bill under control. For Michael, security matters more than speed. He is not chasing financial breakthroughs, only a life without disruption. Beneath that stability, however, is a concern that has lingered for years. The federal student loan Michael signed for in his early 20s never truly disappeared. After graduating, he made payments consistently for a while. Then an economic downturn hit. Work was interrupted. Payments slowed. By the time he found his footing again, the loan had grown more complicated, with accrued interest and a status that was no longer simple or clear. When the pandemic arrived and collections were paused, Michael felt as if a heavy, invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. No reminder letters, no monthly pressure, no fear of immediate enforcement. He understood that the pause came from government-level decisions extended through multiple phases. But to him, it was not about policy. It was something deeply human. It meant time. During that period, Michael believed he was acting reasonably. He focused on stabilizing his life after disruption. He prioritized work, health, and family obligations. He knew programs existed that allowed borrowers to rehabilitate loans after falling behind. He heard about upcoming changes to the repayment system. But because no direct demand was aimed at him, he believed he remained in a relatively safe zone. Life before the turning point showed no obvious warning signs. Michael went to work every day, paid his bills on time, and continued believing that when something truly needed to be addressed, the system would tell him. What he did not realize was that millions of others just like him were waiting for the same signal. And while they waited, the underlying conditions of the system were quietly changing in ways not everyone would be ready for. The first approach did not come as a specific action. It came through the absence of action. After the pandemic-related collection pauses ended, Michael waited for a clear signal telling him what to do next. Instead, he received prolonged silence. No personalized letters, no urgent requests for response. The system appeared frozen, and that created a dangerous impression that nothing had truly begun. In Michael's mind, that silence carried a specific meaning. He believed that if the situation was serious, it would be clearly communicated. He believed he would have time to prepare, to evaluate, to choose. The system's first move was not to demand payment, but to allow borrowers to assume that everything was still being extended, even as underlying conditions were already shifting. From that assumption, trust began to form. Michael was not alone in believing this. He read the news and saw that millions of other student loan borrowers were in the same position. Relief programs were described as multi-stage efforts. Official statements emphasized that borrowers would have opportunities to recover their loans. There was no urgent language, no hard deadlines tied to individuals. Michael's trust did not come from denial, but from the sense that this was a shared reality. That trust was reinforced by daily life. His paycheck arrived in full. No money was withheld. No signal suggested he was approaching a concrete consequence. His financial life ran smoothly enough for him to treat student loans as a future issue rather than an active risk. By not intervening, the system made delay feel reasonable. Based on that trust, Michael acted the way many adults do. He reordered his financial priorities, placing immediate needs first. Rent, health insurance, living costs, and family obligations were handled consistently. Student loans were pushed further back, not because he denied them, but because he believed there was still time to deal with them later. Each month, without consequences, reinforced that decision. Michael told himself he was acting responsibly within limited income. He was not avoiding the problem. He was postponing it. But within that chain of postponement, the loan's status continued to deteriorate without his consent. While he lived a normal life, the system continued recording, classifying, and preparing its next steps. Some warning signs appeared, but they were too fragmented to form a clear alarm. His credit score did not improve despite never missing other payments. A rental application required a higher than expected deposit. He read analyses showing that serious student loan delinquency among renters was rising rapidly, but he did not connect that trend to himself. These signals stayed at the edge of awareness, irritating but not enough to break the sense of safety. The point of maximum risk began when the larger picture came into focus. Tens of millions of student loan borrowers nationwide carried federal debt totaling trillions of dollars. Millions had gone without payment for long periods and were classified as seriously delinquent or in default. As the scale grew too large to keep postponing, the system began restoring non-voluntary collection tools that had been paused. Tax refund and Social Security offsets resumed, signaling that the leniency phase was ending. At the same time, preparations began for wage garnishment among working borrowers. This was not an emotional decision. It was the result of data, status, classification, and legal procedures designed long before. Michael did not know that while he believed he still had time, his file had already entered a different phase. Technical steps to verify employment information were quietly underway. Once completed, wage garnishment could be triggered without his initiative. The notice, when it arrived, would be the final step in a process prepared long in advance. At that point, risk was no longer theoretical. It had become an active mechanism. The turning point did not arrive dramatically. It came on an ordinary afternoon when Michael opened an official envelope delivered to his home. The letter used standard administrative language without threats or emotion. But after the first few lines, Michael understood he had entered a completely different stage. The letter stated that because his federal student loan was in default, a portion of his income would be withheld directly from his wages, beginning after 30 days, if no alternative action was taken. Michael read the letter repeatedly, not because he did not understand it, but because he could not believe it applied to him. In his mind, default was a vague concept associated with people who had fully given up. He never imagined that someone working steadily and paying bills on time could be placed into the same enforcement mechanism. His first reaction was not panic, but deep confusion. It felt like being pulled into a decision that had already been finalized, where his role was reduced to receiving notice. Michael sought help. He called the number listed in the letter, waited through long hold times, and listened to information he had previously skimmed but never treated as urgent. He was told the process was legal. He was told he had received the required notice period. Options were explained, from requesting a hearing to attempting repayment or negotiating alternative arrangements. But none allowed him to return to the earlier stage when flexibility still existed. The moment of exposure in this story was not a person being revealed, but an understanding. Michael realized that what he believed to be systemic leniency was only a technical pause. There was no promise it would last indefinitely, no guarantee that every case would be handled gently. Once data confirmed default status, the next steps unfolded as designed, regardless of individual circumstances. Michael's emotional response came slowly but heavily. As he calculated the impact, he realized that up to 15% of his after-tax income could be withheld for an extended period until the loan was resolved or he exited default. For a budget already tightly managed, this was not an inconvenience. It was a direct blow to the stability he had worked hard to maintain. Confusion gave way to helplessness. There was no one to argue with, no emotional appeal to make. Everything operated within a clear legal framework where his initiative had arrived too late. He blamed himself for equating silence with safety, for believing time would always be available. This was the true climax of the story. Not because of the money withheld, but because Michael understood control had shifted. Once the system intervenes directly in income, all other choices become secondary. What made the moment most unsettling was the realization that many others would only understand this when they stood exactly where he was. Michael's financial damage did not appear as a shocking number all at once. It showed up as small but persistent changes in daily life. When wage garnishment began, each paycheck was reduced just enough to disrupt the balance he had maintained for years. Expenses once carefully managed now had no margin. A bill was delayed. An emergency fund was tapped earlier than planned. Each adjustment carried the uneasy sense of living with less security than before. Michael soon realized that recovering money already withheld was nearly impossible. The collection process was not designed to reverse. It was built to continue until the loan exited default or was resolved through another mechanism. This forced Michael to accept that what had been lost could not be regained through late effort. His focus shifted to limiting future damage. Recovery began when Michael confronted the system he had long avoided. He studied official information carefully, learning timelines, legal conditions, and remaining options. The process was not reassuring. It revealed the complexity of the loan and the cost of prolonged delay. But it also restored a limited sense of agency. Through understanding, Michael restructured his personal finances. He cut expenses already modest. He adjusted priorities without assuming another leniency period would arrive. Most importantly, he shared his situation with family. Speaking openly did not reduce financial pressure, but it ended isolation and shame. The greatest change was not in numbers, but in perspective. Michael no longer viewed the loan as an external problem imposed on him, nor himself as a personal failure. He recognized that he had underestimated the power of delay and the force of legal systems once activated. This resolution is not a clean ending. Michael is still adjusting, still living with consequences. But he regained clarity in how he faces financial obligations. He no longer treats silence as safety. He understands that in large systems, inaction is itself an action, and sometimes the most expensive one. If Michael could go back, he knows exactly when he would change course. Not the day he received the garnishment letter, but years earlier, when silence felt like protection. He would stop asking whether trouble existed today. He would ask a harder, more honest question. What happens if the system restarts before I am ready? The first lesson is that student debt does not exist separately from the rest of financial life. It affects housing, emergency savings, healthcare, and future planning. When a debt can directly access income, it becomes part of the financial foundation, not a side obligation. Ignoring that connection leads many people to underestimate risk. Michael also learned that systems do not operate on intent, they operate on status. Once a loan is classified as seriously delinquent or in default, subsequent steps unfold regardless of effort or character. Consistency in process replaces compassion, making delay especially dangerous. Another lesson is that major policy changes rarely arrive suddenly. They are often announced early but felt later. Those who fail to act in the early window often realize consequences only after choices narrow. For Michael, the leniency period created a false sense of safety, causing him to miss the phase where adjustment was still flexible. The story highlights a simple but overlooked principle. Not all debt carries equal risk. Debt that allows direct access to income has a different weight entirely. Once income is affected, every other plan must adjust around what remains. Recognizing this early can change how risk is managed. Michael learned that financial literacy is not just about earning or investing. It is about understanding how regulations and policies shape personal outcomes over time. Many believe that doing nothing wrong ensures protection. In reality, systems respond to data and status, and reversing those labels is difficult once applied. Most importantly, Michael learned that confronting uncomfortable issues early costs far less than waiting in hope. Reading a long notice, making a difficult call, or choosing an unpleasant option today can preserve choice. Waiting until pain arrives often leads to consequences that last for years. You may not be in Michael's position, but you or someone you care about may be delaying a financial decision simply because it has not become painful yet. This story is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to make you ask one question. In your financial life, what is being ignored because it has been quiet for too long? And if the system restarted tomorrow, how many choices would you still have?